Good evening. Honored speakers and guests, students and fellows of Tembusu College and other colleges. Welcome to the 27th Tembusu Forum. 27, amazing, huh? We convene these twice a semester to bring big issues of the day before the college and give our students practice in asking questions and listening closely to diverse opinions as well as forming their own. I'm sure there's already lots of opinions in the room on tonight's issue, poverty and inequality. In fact, I've been told that this is one of the largest audiences we've ever had at a forum, not to put any pressure on the speakers. When I came to Singapore 19 years ago, I'd lived in 3 large cities, Boston, London, and Tokyo. One of my earliest impressions of Singapore was that it felt more egalitarian than these other 3 cities, or really any city that I'd ever been to. Partly it was the domination of the landscape by HDB flats. The boom in condos hadn't really started at that time. Part of it was that taxis and public transport here were cheaper than anywhere I'd ever been. And I was delighted I didn't have to buy a car, which I never did. Healthcare was on par with that of the United States, where I'd come from, but far cheaper and more accessible. No one could have imagined 2 decades ago that a novel entitled Crazy Rich Asians would ever have Singapore as its setting. Conspicuous consumption wasn't the national pastime then. I'll leave the analysis of all of this to our speakers, but I'm sure that some of them will point out that inequality and inequity aren't just local, but also global issues. In my own country, the United States, it's off the rails in terms of the felt disparity between rich and poor. How to begin to bring order and clarity to such a huge issue as we have tonight in front of us? If anyone's up to the task, it's the organizer and convener of tonight's forum, Professor Tommy Ko, to whom I now concede the podium. Professor Ko.
Thank you very much, Greg. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 27th Tembusu Forum. This is a very important forum. But before I get to the topic of the forum, I would like to welcome some special guests. The most important guest we have this evening is actually a student of the college, Ting Jun Heng, who's sitting right at the back. Jun Heng, can you raise your hand? To the non-Tembusans here, I should explain that Jun Heng was one of the 4 students in a college who were involved in a horrific accident in April last year. It killed one of our students, Cathy Ong, and injured the other 3. Jun Heng was so severely injured that for months he was in a coma at NUH. I want to say that I'm very proud of the college because students from the college never gave up on him. Through all these months, through the ordeal, they continued to visit him. They consoled the mother, the sister, and spoke to him, not knowing whether he could hear us, encouraged him to recover. And a miracle has happened. He not only regained his consciousness, he's made tremendous improvement, and Jun Heng is preparing to come back to college. So Jun Heng, we can't wait to welcome you back to the college, and we say to you, 加油. I want to introduce, let's give him a round of applause. When I see Jun Heng among us this evening and remembered the many months when he was lying in coma, it's like a miracle has happened. So the Tembusu family could not be more pleased. I want to introduce a few other guests with us this evening. We have a reporter from Straits Times, Yun Sin. The ground rule tonight is that this forum is not for reporting, but we are happy to invite you, Yun Sin, to listen to the forum. And if you have a compelling question, don't hesitate to ask the four panelists. I would also like to welcome Dr. Faisal bin Yahya. Faisal, can you put up your hand? Faisal is a colleague from the Institute of Policy Studies and is the editor of a book on inequality in Singapore. Let's give him a round of applause. Next, I want to introduce Ms. Shelley Gorani, who is the head of advocacy and research of a very powerful women's organization called AWARE. I think the proper name is the Association of Women for Action and Research. It has played a tremendously important role in the emancipation and empowerment of women in Singapore. So, welcome, Shelley. Next, I want to introduce two very dear friends who are public intellectuals, but they are also acting as a moral conscience of Singapore. I refer to Donald Low. Donald, can you stand up, please? Donald is a former Vice Dean for Executive Education at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I want to introduce his comrade in crime, Mr. Yo Lam Keong. Lam Keong, please stand up. In one of Lam Keong's previous incarnations, he was the chief economist of GIC. Very proud of both of them. Now, let me just say a few words about why I chose the topic. I want to start with basic principles. I recall that in our national pledge, we pledge ourselves as one united people, regardless of race, language, or religion, to build a democratic society based on justice and equality. This is our collective pledge and our vision for Singapore. Poverty and inequality are therefore not consistent with our national pledge and our collective aspiration. So quite apart from the fact that poverty and inequality pose a challenge to our social cohesion and harmony, it is also inconsistent with our national pledge. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that poverty has two meanings. There's absolute poverty and relative poverty. Absolute poverty means an individual or household whose financial means are not sufficient to enable them to acquire the basic necessities of life. And there are three groups of people who fall into this group of absolute poor. The low-wage workers, the poor workers, the poor unemployed, and the poor retirees. This is the first meaning of poverty, absolute poverty. But poverty has another meaning, which is relative poverty. The term relative poverty is used to apply to families the universal rule is if a family's income is 50% below the median income. In Singapore, the median wage is $3,000. So if a family's income or an individual income is less than 50% of the median income, then the person is generally regarded as poor, relatively poor. And according to one of Lam Keong's writings, Lam Keong, I don't know whether you stand by the number. In one of your previous writings, you say that there are 110,000 to 140,000 households in Singapore who fit the definition of absolute poverty. And also, according to this wonderful handbook on inequality, poverty, and unmet social needs, published by SMU, the Lian Center for Social Innovation. In this report, and Jonathan is the director of the center, it is said that 20 to 35% of our households live in relative poverty. So those were the introductory remarks I wanted to say about poverty. Now I'll just say a few words about inequality. Our collective aspiration is to live in a Singapore that is both just and equal. But we know that absolute equality is not achievable. What we want is a relatively equal Singapore. The economists have something called the Gini coefficient, which measures equality and inequality. The Gini coefficient of Singapore is about 0.43. And one of the UN agencies has said that when a country's Gini coefficient approaches 4 or 0.4, then it's a wake-up call, it's a signal. Our aspiration in Singapore is that we want to live in a prosperous country, but also one that's relatively equal and, if possible, relatively free of social classes. So this is the big context for tonight's forum. We've called it Poverty and Inequality in Singapore, Challenge and Response, because we want two speakers to talk about the challenges and two speakers to talk about responses. So let me begin by introducing the first speaker. The first speaker is Jonathan Chang. Can you stand up, Jonathan? Oh, no, just wait there, wait. Jonathan looks like a movie star, and he wants to audition for the sequel to Crazy Rich Asians. But seriously, Jonathan is the executive director of the Lian Center for Social Innovation. He's also an adjunct professor of social entrepreneurship at SMU. His ambition is to educate and nurture change leaders across the region. Jonathan is a product of American education. Went to UC Berkeley as an undergraduate, Stanford Business School, has spoken at Harvard, won many prizes in both Stanford and UC Berkeley, and his extracurricular activities is mountaineering. And you'll be pleased to know that he's conquered 4 of the peaks of the world, including Kilimanjaro. Jonathan, come and speak to us for 15 minutes on their work at the Lian Center.
All right. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. My deepest gratitude to Professor Tomiko and the organizing committee for inviting me and give me the opportunity to speak to all of you. And thanks to the students as well that showed up here today. I was worried that I was gonna talk to the empty seats, but now that I was told the highest ever attendance, I'm gonna step up my game a little bit more. But you see, the movie Crazy Rich Asian is being referenced a few times, and that is an interesting discussion in itself because it makes the discussion around poverty and inequality, especially in Singapore, suddenly become a little bit more challenging, especially if we have to communicate that to the outside world, because now it's become a global sort of thing. People know, they have this image of Singapore and what kind of wealth that we have. But you see, inequalities, they come in different format, and then also they varies and depends on what you're talking about and in what context as well. So I'm not gonna talk about the handbook on income inequality, poverty, and an unmet social need, because you can actually go to our website. You can download this publication. It's been out for a few years, so I highly recommend you to do so. But I'm going to reference a new publication that we just released over the weekend, in which it is about food insecurity in Singapore. Now, I know perhaps you think about food insecurity. We have so much food. Yes, but we also waste a lot of food. That is one. Second, when it is not the availability of food, but for some communities or some people, depending on their income bracket, getting the right kind of food on a daily basis is an issue. And that is what food insecurity is about, is this feeling of uncertainty about what I can consume even today, the next day, and so forth. Yes, we do have a lot of VWOs, we do have a lot of nonprofit organizations or community organizers out there that providing perhaps free lunches, dinners, or vouchers and meals and things like that. But in social innovation, we see that as it's direct solution, yes? Which what that means is you're addressing a solution, a problem at that particular moment only for that time. But it doesn't go deeper into how we can make these people become sustainable, so they don't have to get free lunches and free dinners and vouchers, so that they can consume what they would like to consume on their own. And if you boil down a little bit deeper, then you start to talk about, okay, well, where they live, and also oftentimes we must talk about gender. One of the programs that the Lian Center for Social Innovation recently has sort of taken under its wing is the Sharon Foster program. It's actually founded in collaboration with AWARE and Singapore Management University. So for those that are interested in issues or around women empowerment and just issues that are facing women, I highly recommend you to also check out the website and then sign up to the events, because we do, recently we have I think in 3 weeks we'll have a conference on the move, also featuring prominent women innovators. But as I said earlier, when you look at gender, then the inequality and poverty it has a different story as well, because when you look at single mothers or divorcees, for example, and even those that come from family, sort of intact family, because it is known that women live longer than men. So when you took a lot of time out of the workforce and had to take care of your family, and then when the husband pass away, suddenly you are the sole caretaker of the entire family, and that is difficult, right? And also depending on the time of where they are in their life, it's the society where they come from. Perhaps it is not so kind to them as well. How do I know this? Because I was raised by a widow. My father passed away when I was 4, so my mother had to raise everybody on her own. So with a middle school education, a widow and a woman, you can see the type of discrimination and sexism that she has to face on a daily basis. But that is what, sort of there's an unspoken inequalities that people have to face. Now, there are many solutions out there, perhaps, and one of them that I truly believe, not the only one, is one of many, that I personally promote, that I personally support as well through the center, as well as in my sort of personal capacity, is looking at social issues and then trying to address it through social entrepreneurship. For those that are interested in social entrepreneurship, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but for those that are not that familiar with this concept, it is one of the ways as well to take what we know, what we're good at in terms of creating wealth through the private sector, through entrepreneurship, and looking at from the perspective of what can we do to address a social issue while at the same time creating jobs, creating revenues, and selling products and services. And there are a number of ways. For instance, again, over the weekend we had a hackathon in which a lot of young people like yourself came in and thought about how to create an app or applications or software to address the food wastage, for example, in Singapore. How to make sure that food that is left over that is still good, I'm not talking about expired milk that has been around for a month, but it's food that people do not consume, and what happens to it rather than throwing it away. There's a better way to distribute it, and that's just a simple solution that we all can do. So as I said, there are a number of ways to address the inequalities, and also within communities, there's no better way than being out there on the ground and really trying to get sense of what inequality and poverty really look like. I'll give you a couple of examples and personal stories that I've observed. So whenever I have time, unfortunately I don't have as much as I'd like it to be. I volunteer in grassroots organizations. I go to MPS, Meet the People session, and especially in certain neighborhoods. I do house visits as well, as much as I could. And that is a way for me to sort of get a sense beyond the policy, beyond the conversation, because now you're talking to the individuals, right? You're not looking at statistics. You're not looking at X number percentage of people. You're talking to this one person in front of you, and you see it for yourself when a family of 5 have to share a one-room flat, rental flats. There is a district, I don't need to mention which district, but there's a district in Singapore that there are a number of rental flats in that particular district, and people do live there with a large family. And being there and talking to these people will give you a different perspective of what poverty and inequality is beyond the terms. I'm going to close out with one story that really moved me, it took me quite some time to shake it off my mind. In one of the house visits, so we knock on the door, and this older lady, Chinese lady, came out, and she couldn't speak English, so she was speaking in Chinese. And we just asked her how she's doing, how are you doing? That one sentence brought her, down to tears. She was crying, and then she said she was starting to talk about how her husband, they got divorced a long time ago. Now she lives by herself, and she has pain all over her body, and she's trying to get a job on Orchard Road. She mentioned about a few places that's trying to get entry-level jobs or whatever jobs that she could find, but she faced the discrimination. She felt that she was discriminated because she's older, and she felt that even the younger colleagues were not treating her that nice. So at the end, she was replaced, and she didn't have any income, and she didn't know what kind of system that was available for her. And her house is very messy. Because of her pain, physical pain, she was not able to move very much, and she was not able to move things in her her flat as well. And because of that, there are bugs and sort of insects and things like that, and they're starting to bite her. And she showed us the rash on the skin and things like that. And so, as you see, one problem leads to another, and it leads to another, and it gets compounded. And that is why sometimes this discussion should move beyond of very simple sort of one-liners like, why can't you just get a job? Or why can't you just go out there? Why can't you just ask for help and this and that? But oftentimes when your back is against the wall and you have little comprehension of the system, you get overwhelmed, and you feel that there's no one is there to help you or understand you, and a simple gesture of a question, how are you doing, will make a huge difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. The next speaker is a good friend and colleague from the Institute of Policy Studies. As you know, I've long been associated with IPS, having served as its previous director and previous chairman. And IPS is celebrating their 30th anniversary this year. Dr. Mathews is a senior research fellow at IPS, and he is a prolific researcher and author. He's worked on more than 40 research projects looking at social policies involving race, religion, immigrants, integration, aging, and poverty. I want to just refer to two reports that he helped to write. One on the working with low-income single mothers in the Indian community, report that he helped to do with Cinder. But he's also worked with Mendaki and written for them a report on empowering low-income families. So I've asked Mathew to share with us some of his more recent research, working with low-income families. Mathew, please.
Thank you, Prof. Ko, and thank you, Tembusu College, for inviting me to share my thoughts here. The topic on poverty, income inequality is something obviously very current, or at least of some interest in Singapore. The fact that since August, I have done 3 different appearances at different places, talking about different topics along the same line, tells you that this is something that's been of some interest, at least quite a lot of people. But of course, today I've not. Do I have slides? Oh yeah, I can change it here. Okay, I can. Thank you. Thanks, this helps. I've decided not to circulate, rerun my slides that I've used before. So this is a new topic on balancing dignity and responsibility in helping low-income families. I've been working on issues of low-income families for about 10 years now, a variety of different kinds of settings, both government and a lot of social service sector providers who have always been trying to help low-income families, and we're thinking about how to do it in the best way possible. And I want to reflect about the thought about dignity and the whole issue about dignity. It was very interesting this afternoon at lunchtime. My wife and I, we went to visit a church member who's very much older. She's about 80-something, and she was there in hospital. And when we met her, she was kind of ranting. She said, days by, when her husband was alive, he was a pensioner, so she would be able to get decent treatment from the hospital. Now the husband has passed on, and so she does not get any of those benefits. And so she's got to pay, so some of the tablets she takes about $10 a pill, so they're quite expensive. This is in our, in SGH. And so, because the cost is so expensive, she finally had to ask the doctor, how can I manage all this? And so, of course, sent her to social welfare, the social work department, the hospital. And, this lady was just, you could hear her pain when she talked about it. When she goes down there, immediately the first question they ask, Auntie, what kind of housing do you have? And she has to say, she lives in a private housing. These are, old teachers, and so they have a little bit of a small, tiny little old house. It's not at all nice and flashy and not renovated, but it's very old. So because of that, she's obviously not eligible for many of the aid. And so she says, I have so many people, hundreds of them have to ask me question after question after question before they can decide to give her a little bit of a discount in terms of the price. So of course, it became very clear to me, this whole thing about the loss of dignity and how people feel about that when they have to go through some of that. Mother Teresa mentioned this, and I think everybody has probably heard it. I will never tire of repeating this. What the poor need the most is not pity, but love. They need to feel respect for their human dignity. It's neither less nor different from the dignity of any other human being. Just yesterday, if you read the newspaper, you have read about Emmanuel Macron, and this was reported both in The Guardian and Independent and various newspapers. And there you see him talking to a French man who is 25. He's an aspiring gardener. And he says, I'm 25 years, I send resumes and cover letters. They don't lead to anything. He's looking for a gardening job. And President Macron says, if you're willing and motivated, he says, obviously in French, in hotels, cafes, restaurants, construction, there's not a single place I go where they don't say they're looking for people. No one. It's true. If I cross the street, I'll find you one. So get going. How many of you would say what President Macron would say? All right, I mean, but if you look at the commentaries, of course, in Guardian, I mean, of course, they were taking reports from Agency France. And when they were reporting, obviously there are two sides. Even in French society, there are a lot of people who feel strongly that that's exactly what Macron should say, to tell poor people or people who are not working that they should just take whatever job is possible. And but of course, he gets criticized by others who don't agree with that. So you have this tussle. On one hand, people feel strongly about dignity, and the others, and like Macron, who probably feels that he is giving some dignity to this young man who is not working, wants to get him a job, because work provides you dignity, but it's not the kind of job that the person is wanting. And he has trained himself and want to work in something which is very different. So in some way or another, he feels that he's being stripped of his dignity. What does dignity entail? And you can read quite a bit of readings on this, and different philosophers have different ideas. But in many ways, one, it just means that there is the notion that equal human value. Everybody, whether you're rich or poor, is just as important. And what you value shouldn't be too different. If a rich person says it's important for me to have my children have tuition, then the poor person should also be entitled to that. Self-respect ensures that individuals can meet their basic daily needs and necessities so they can function normally, have some kind of autonomy. You have the capacity for choice. You don't just have to take what is dished out to you, but you can make a decision whether I want to have Burger King or McDonald's. So you make that decision yourself. And positive mutuality, which is the idea that you can enjoy meaningful social relationships. Now, all these are intertwined because you cannot have meaningful social relationships sometimes if you don't have, for instance, the ability to meet some of your basic daily necessities. It just makes it very difficult for you to be able to be included within society. If you cannot have a proper pair of clothing, then it's hard for you to deal with someone else who may feel very offended by your dress sense, for instance. There's a little cartoon there, but it's probably not the dignity of work, but the indignity of work. As you can see in all the statements right there, work, as people expect it to be, is supposed to bring dignity, but in many ways, work can also, for many people, especially if you're in the low-income group, might find it a lot more complex. It says it takes about 12 hours to feel like a human being again, and then it's back to work. Now, I pulled out this because this doesn't come from Singapore, and so John won't beat me up for this, but this is from this is Hong Kong. So, but I would say that, I mean, I'm sure Singapore, it's not the same, but I'm sure there are many people who would think like this, probably will not articulate it. I'm sure, we don't have any official paper stating something like this, but in many ways, this is how I think quite a few people feel. We should aim to change the attitudes of the unemployed recipients who are less motivated by placing emphasis on their social responsibilities, the need to re-establish self-reliance, and helping them understand that employment contributes to the well-being of the individual, the family, and whole community. So just take note of the fact that we aim to change the attitudes. So it's so important in the move towards helping people. And many countries have adopted what is called workfare, where there is an emphasis on making sure that people are legitimately, properly employed if they're going to get any help from the state. And so it's a lot of change of attitude. So we're going to change attitudes because obviously this group of low-income people have bad attitudes, and then we must help them to be motivated because they are just not motivated. So these are ideas, and of course they're not responsible. So these are ideas that people generally have, and I think though this was written in Hong Kong many years ago, this is 20 years, I think this is something that people won't put up nowadays, but I think it does inform how quite a bit of welfare policy actually works. The message that we aim to get across, any job is better than no job, no pay is better than no pay. This is a Hong Kong scheme, but if you notice, if you just look at the conditions which are attached to it, if you want to get help from the system, and I just checked, I just saw a 2017 paper, so I know this is, many of the conditions are still there, but job seeker has to apply for at least 2 jobs per fortnight, develop and update an individual work plan, write job-seeking diaries, attend regular work plan interviews. He cannot decline any job offered on account of the mode of job, whether it's full-time, part-time, and all that, the working hours and the wages. He has to do voluntary work. This is interesting. They add on top of that, so you have to do voluntary work such as cleaning country parks, gardening, and all that. And that is if you want to get that particular kind of help. And I looked at it 2017, this is March 2017, and they say consequence of non-compliance with the requirement of the undertaking. So it's very, very clear. If you refuse to sign that undertaking, then you lose a lot. Cease, terminate the program, you lose that. You need to repay what has been overpaid to you. So it's fairly draconian. But this idea about when people look at this, it says, is there any dignity? You try to get help from an agency, and what you have is that people completely kind of stripping any dignity from you and putting a whole lot of conditions on you. There's been a move around the world, and France is a good example, where though it's been very generous in welfare provisions for many years, there are substantial portions of French society which are going against that. And they're trying their best to cut people off welfare dependency. And because the idea is that, well, if people get welfare, then they will kind of stay on welfare. So you want to try to push as many people out of that. So the way to do that is to make it just so difficult to get onto welfare. And so hopefully people will not get onto it. But then, sadly enough, when you do that, you stop people from actually having the only safety net that is afforded to some people. And you stop the potential for them to potentially bounce back. I'm skipping all this because of lack of time. But I want to just make a broad point. In Singapore, in general, Singaporeans, if you look at low-income Singaporeans, and we've done a whole bunch of different projects, and it was very, very clear to me. Now, you can say that people, of course, never tell you the truth, but you will notice I should just show one of that. There's so much of this belief that we should be self-reliant. And this is something that people share. It's something that their families police. It is so internalized in people's life. Nobody wants to be a free rider. Everybody feels that they need to be disciplined. They need to use their finances properly. And so you will really come from a society where there is such a strong stigma about getting help or being handouts. There's a strong push towards being responsible. And of course, people feel that sense of responsibility. So when you go through aid systems which are punishing, it can have a major effect in robbing your sense of dignity of who you are. So just a few points. When I have 3 minutes, I'll finish each in 1 minute. One is, how does the community come to play here? I think it's so important that society start re-examining some of our deep-seated assumptions. You read all these statements here. People on welfare will abuse money. Incentives of work can only be possible by low welfare payments. Each of this, now, if you look at it right now, you'll say, well, you know what, I don't agree with that. But many Singaporeans, you actually get them to anonymously answer questions, they will actually agree, at least a good portion of Singaporeans will agree to some of this. We do believe the fact that people who are poor, for instance, sometimes are not responsible. They don't work hard. They don't make all the right choices. But very often, I think we forget a lot of the structural forces which put people in some of those situations. Now, nobody's saying that there is no choice making it. Nobody has agency. People have agency. But there are a lot of structures which make it sometimes hard for people to immediately jump up and get better. So we should be careful about some of our ideas in terms of policing welfare. In Hong Kong, they had hotlines, for instance, to get people to report if you notice somebody else who is being a welfare fraud, for instance, called the Special Investigation Department. We will investigate that. You don't want to have that, because once you have that, you have this sense you get this picture in people's mind that welfare recipients are problematic people. And for us to be able to change some of our mind, sometimes it's so important for us to begin to allow people to interact across social economic levels, because when you start making those interactions, you know that people who may not be as well off are not in that situation because they just chose that way. There are many, many forces which have led to that, and sometimes they're stuck in that situation. Secondly, idea about dignity through work. That's another big area where people find dignity and should find dignity. But sadly in Singapore, we still have a way to go. If you look at, for instance, the wages and the benefits. Now, Singapore does have a progressive wage model. I know these have been, the salaries have gone up a little bit here and there, but in many ways, it's still very, very low. If you look at our median income, and for instance, a cleaner and many other jobs like that, salaries are very, very substantially lower. And so if you try to balance expenditures versus income, it is hard to meet normal needs without some additional help. So we really have to think about helping people get dignity through work, whether it's by making sure that their jobs are better protected. Our progressive wage model, at this point of time, I think it's based on the fact that what employers are willing to pay, but really we should be thinking about making it a little bit more generous. There should be some kind of inflation-guarded wages, for instance, not rather a one-set $1,200 mark, and we forget about how inflation might need to change that. Also, full-time positions. Many of our jobs at the lower end, where low-income workers are at, tend to be, contract positions. You're there for 2 years, and then you move on, and you try, and you get back to a starting salary again. So it really is one which is deprived very often of benefits too. Then, of course, for many low-income families, especially those who've got children, there's a big issue about childcare and how you manage those things. And, of course, the notion of giving people dignity through ensuring that they have adequate training so that they're able to not just to be able to know that they can be assets in the workforce. I won't go through that. And then finally, let me just talk about dignity through social service assistance. And I know that this has been something that MSF and the government has been working over the years. But one, of course, the broad one is really the ease of the process of seeking aid. It really is dehumanizing when you have to keep going and telling your story over and over again in different agencies. When you have to reapply and reapply, you got aid for 3 months and then again, tell your story again, update. It has a way of removing the dignity that a person feels. As many people often see, it feels like you have to beg for help. Then, of course, there's a whole big issue about training and how well people are trained. I just heard a friend of mine who was helping a particular family who is not doing well, and I said, we should, instead of you all pooling resources, why don't you make sure that you get the SSO and FSC to help in that family? And the lady recounted how one of the workers, the staff, the agency, this person here is a family, but he is disabled. And the worker asked, the first question the worker asked was that, you're disabled, why did you have children? Of course, for him, it was just too much for him to handle. And so he says, I don't want any of that help anymore. I do not want it. So he feels very strongly about it. Then, of course, it's very fortunate somebody is able to help. But really, we should minimize this and make this completely absent. And there needs to be services in Singapore which people can get, which don't require them to give a whole long story of why they need it. We've got all kinds of means tested. I do agree that sometimes you need to have means tested kind of provisions. But many times there are some services, to ask for food is something, it's probably the lowest thing in a society like Singapore. People feel they need to guard their dignity. They're not going to go out and ask for food. So if you ask for food, there should be no reason why people need to find out and inquire why you need it and all the rest of it. And finally, of course, we should think about community-based empowerment strategies. Sometime back, Prof. Koh showed me one of the publications we did with Mendaki, and that was an intervention they did some time back, and it still carries on, where beneficiaries of services come together and pool together, sitting down, discussing how they can better their lives. And I was able to observe many of these sessions, and I can say it was very, very heartwarming to know that among themselves, they were able to strategize and think of better ways of moving forward, the right kind of training, the kinds of education pathways. And then as a group, rather than just relying on a social worker or another agency among themselves, they were able to live themselves and get to a better state. I think I run out of time. Thank you very much.
Jonathan and Mathew have shared with us some aspects of poverty and inequality in Singapore. Jonathan talked about food insecurity. I think Mathew's big message to us this evening is the need for us to respect the dignity of the people we are trying to help. Now we talk about the challenge, now let's talk about the response. What is the government doing to help these poor and low-income families? What is our VWO trying to help? So the third speaker is Jonathan. It's John Lim, sorry. John, like Jonathan, is also the product of American tertiary education. He studied at Cornell University, was a brilliant scholar and graduated with summa cum laude, which translate to first-class honors. Well, you got both, right? Summa and magna. According to your CV, you got both summa and magna. And then he also went to Stanford Business School and did obviously very well there because he was designated as the R.J. Miller Scholar. Instead of going to the private sector to make a pile of money, he joined the government and is the Senior Director of the Social Policy and Services Group of the Ministry in Social and Family Development. He's going to talk to us tonight about what the government is doing to help these poor and low-income families. John, please.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, let me just test the slides. Okay. Thanks. It's actually very hard to, well, firstly, I didn't get summa, just for the record. But very hard to come after Mathew because there's so much to respond to. Some of which I really agree, and some of it I think it's not really disagree, but just to kind of nuance. Because I find that really reality is a lot more textured than we might make it out to be. I've seen cases of abuse, as in abusing the system or policies. I've seen genuine cases that really struggle. And I think being in this line, you kind of see the spectrum and you learn not to pass too quick a judgment on things, including policies and programs. And some of it is not the policies, it's the delivery. So many things I actually agree with in Mathew's presentation. But thanks very much for having me speak to you and share some perspectives from the public policy and governance standpoint. So just to set a quick context, our social compact and approach to social assistance has actually evolved over the years. In the early days after the war, it was really ground up initiatives that drove a lot of the helps that we saw. Salvation Army, a lot of ground up assistance, but not very organized, certainly not very well structured state provided assistance. And then over the years, it kind of shifted. And I'll just let you kind of take a quick scan of PM Lee's NDR speech, 2013, just a snippet there. The basic point being that we recognize you can't rely totally on the individual. There must be helps, and the state has an important role to play here. So there are actually quite a number of schemes. In fact, this in itself has been one of the concerns of many observers. So many schemes, how do I figure this out? How do I navigate this? What's the alternative if you have only one scheme? That too is not the answer. So importantly to understand, important for us is to understand kind of the rationale behind this. And so I'll just give you a broad guiding principle, and that is we want to be able to extend assistance to households and individuals based on their needs in a flexible and targeted manner. Now, this means actually different thresholds for different kinds of schemes, and that creates some confusion, but at the same time, if they actually get the help they need and they're able to navigate, it actually provides better than if you had one line. So here you kind of balance between efficiency, ease of communication, and actually meeting the needs. And that is the public policy quandary that we find ourselves having to try to address a lot of the time. But you can see the broad domains here: home ownership, healthcare, employment, education, retirement needs, and then a safety net that covers kind of the residual, whatever you need that you can't get from the other schemes. And that's ComCare right at the bottom, short to medium term assistance for those that need temporary help, and long-term assistance for those who are permanently disabled, old and frail. And this one, this basically translates into they get essentially they get help for the rest of their lives if things don't change. So what does this all translate into? It's nice to talk about many schemes. So as an example, this is a real life case. I've just anonymized it. The case is still current. So in March, a woman came seeking financial aid. Her husband had lost his full-time job due to some ongoing court case. The trial was due to take place in April, and she had 4 kids. They had 4 kids. And so what she requested was help to meet the basic living expenses. So that was what ComCare did. So they paid $0 for their HDB rent. They paid $0 for the service and conservancy charges. They paid $0 for school fees, textbooks, uniforms for the 2 kids who were attending primary school. They paid $6 a month per child for full-day childcare. And actually, that was not the cheapest childcare center. If you go to the cheapest ones provided by the anchor operators, you can pay $3 per month for full-day childcare, which is not too bad. And that co-payment was by design, but basically saying that even the $6 per month, it's somewhat informed, at least partially, by a certain choice that you wanted to go to a certain childcare center and not the cheapest. And it could be for legitimate reasons, and here we're not making a judgment on that. There were also some other issues, student care issues for the older 2 kids, and here's where the Family Service Center came in. So in June, the trial had ended. The husband was sentenced to jail. So she came back, asked for ComCare again, and it was renewed. So again, they pay $0 per month for HDB rent, they pay $0 for SNCC, they pay $0 for MOE, and they're still paying $6 a month for the child in childcare. And they're paying $0 again for student care. So by this time, they had added the student care financial assistance. Of course, so this is a live case. The assistance for ComCare is until September this month. So what happens then? I mean, the argument might be, okay, well, then you fall off the cliff. That's actually not quite what happens. And kind of just to clarify the point, so there are concerns that you are given, say, for 3 months, and then you have to keep coming back. Well, it depends on the conditions. Because if, for instance, you are not able to work, and it's for 12 months, and the doctor gives you a certification saying that, hey, you can't work for 12 months. Well, what's the point of asking you to come back after 3 months or 6 months? So we don't. We actually give longer assistance. It all depends on each case. There's no policy imperative saying it is only 3 months, you cannot differ, you cannot deviate. So over the years, not only do we have the policies in place, but what good is it if people don't know how to access it? And to increase the accessibility and the availability, we set up 24 social service officers. So in most HDB towns, there's a social service office there, and they provide social assistance. That's one part. And the other part is kind of working with the local community partners to identify needs and to do the bridging, coordinating cases, etc. So that was done between 2013 and 2015. Those social service officers come under my group right now. So there's ComCare, and there's this SG Cares. I don't have time to talk about this extensively, but there are other initiatives as well in the area of education and employment, and we look at this as a whole of government rather than just a specific ministry. But the last mile, sometimes there are gaps. Sometimes there are gaps because the coordination, the protocols are not quite as sharp or as refined as we would like them to be. Sometimes it's okay. It's just that when it comes down to the individual, some things kind of fall through. How do you mandate, for instance, that everyone must be empathetic? If I tell you by decree, I make it a law, you must be empathetic, it's not going to work. In the same way, we try to train people provide that, but how do you ensure it? I don't think any one of us can ensure that the person next to you is going to be, or yourself. You must be unselfish. You can't do this by decree. And so, recognizing, however, that many cases, they may be properly, they may be satisfactorily handled, and then there will be cases where we need to increase the chances that they'll be handled well. And so we have quite a major effort going on. Here are the 5 key thrusts, but this just really summarizes a whole body of work that's being done now. But we want to equip frontline officers in the government and community agencies to better point individuals and households in need to helps that they need, and also make the back-end connection, not just telling them, but helping to bridge. We want to make it easier for households in need to apply for multiple help schemes, which is exactly the point that Mathew made in his slides. We want to have stronger cross-agency coordination. We want to have integrated service delivery supported by the co-location of services where possible, and where not feasible, at least have video conferencing to support some of this. And enabling and supporting community efforts, which is also something Mathew talked about, which we totally agree with. And where are we? As a nation, actually, we've done pretty well by some measures. Literacy rates are good. Economic growth is good. Very low unemployment rates. Real income growth, not only is it more or less okay, but for the lowest 50% resident households in recent years at least, the real income growth has been faster for those in the bottom half compared to the top half. This doesn't mean we should rest on our laurels, because it could change. But it does mean that over time, if we at least maintain this trajectory, the income divide starts to narrow rather than spread. But it could go the other way if we're not careful. Children born to lower income families in Singapore actually have a higher chance for upward mobility compared to some other mature economies. So in 2015, MOF did a study on income mobility. And so if you see the chart on the, well, let's start with the chart on the left side. Gini coefficients tell you the divide. Now, there will always be people at the top end of the spectrum and always have people at the bottom end of the spectrum. The question is, are they the same people staying in the bottom end of the spectrum over time? Because if that happens, you do not have mobility, and that is a problem. But if you find that there is redistribution, then perhaps it's not as bad a situation. Although we still need to be concerned about how do you give everybody the maximum opportunity. So here you see, if we compare, say, the US and Singapore, the child's quintile. So all these parents, all their parents were taken from the lowest 20% of the income spectrum. That's the starting base. Where do their children end up? 14.3% end up in the top quintile. Then the second highest quintile, 18.8%. And so you find a quarter of them stay in the bottom. This is actually better than in other countries. So on the right-hand side, we do this rough comparison of the top quintile in terms of the children compared to other developed countries, and you find actually we're doing better on this count. Again, we should not rest on our laurels. It's not a given that this will continue, but where are we today? Perhaps not as bad as we might think in some macro measures, even though we have to care at the individual level. So aside from economic measures, how are we doing on the social front? So here are some. Apparently, we're the second happiest country in Asia, 34th in the world by one measure. Really? I hear all that. We're the safest country according to some measures. I think this one people tend to disagree with less. And at least by one index, we're the the best place for children to grow up, tied for first with Slovenia. Of course, indices are like academic rankings, right? We have to take it with a pinch of salt, but at least by some measures, we're not doing too badly. Question is, what will our society be in the years ahead? What will it become? Some things we know are almost predetermined. Well, pretty much predetermined. Smaller families, aging society, higher dependency ratio, but there are some critical things that the jury is out. It could go either way. How will societal values shift? What are the citizens' expectations? How will they help each other or not? What will cohesion be like? Will family support be adequate or not? What we're finding in some surveys is, when you ask people, are you willing to help your family? More people say yes. Are you willing to get help from your family? More people say no. That's actually an issue for us. Because if they're not willing to go to the family, even if the family is willing to help, then it falls on other players, whether it's community or the government. What will the jobs and skills outlook be like? If you have things like the rise of the gig economy, if you have all these kind of disruptions and displacements due to technological advances and the shortening of business cycles, you may actually run the risk of higher retirement inadequacy. So some of the things that we should be concerned about, and that's not comprehensive list. So where do we stand in terms of inequality? If you take a look at our Gini coefficient, this is using, there are different methods, but this is using the OECD method, which people use to compare across countries. Before taxes and transfers were 0.43, after about 0.37, it's remained fairly stable over the last couple of years. And our tax burden is much lower, and that's a policy choice so far. And if you look at our approach, what does this translate into? Actually, if you see on the left, it's what we affectionately call the kueh lapis, right? There are some schemes which are actually universal. So people say, oh, this should be universal. In actual fact, there are schemes that are universal. I talked about education, and education actually is universal. Primary school, secondary school is free. You pay an admin fee, but the tuition and the big part, if you're talking $10,000 per child, that's free. It's all covered by the state. And then you have targeted helps. For those who cannot pay whatever is left as a co-payment by design, we have other helps to help bridge that. So what does this translate into? On the right-hand side of the slide, you see for every tax dollar, and by the way, the top decile pays 40% of the taxes. And so of every tax dollar, middle-income households get $2 back in benefits, and the lower-income households get $4 back. So there is redistribution. Question for us, should we be concerned about inequality? So let me give you two examples just to help our thinking about this. We're in an academic institution, let me use an academic example. You have two academics, two professors. One's very established in the field, this academic A. You have academic B, more junior, works very hard, attains, secures tenure, and reaches the same number and quality of publications and pay in a shorter time. So you reach the point where both of them are about equal in standing, both of them are equal in pay, both of them are equal in achievements according to some measures. Should this person stop working hard? So I see some faces saying no. But why? Because you've achieved parity, and the more the academic B works, the more inequality you create. So that's just food for thought. But another example, you have two schools. One gets more than 3 times the funding as school B. You have individualized education plans, you have a lower student-teacher ratio, you have customized facilities. School B gets the usual funding. Is this fair? Okay, just a quick poll. Who says this is fair? Well, who says this is unfair? Okay, a couple of hands. If I told you that the school A describes a special education school, and it does, this is for those with special needs, who says it's unfair? No hands now. Very interesting. Because you just voted for inequality in one instance. But I told you additional things that set the context. So let me not go through this one. But I wonder if the issue is inequality per se, or if there are more fundamental issues that we should actually be concerned about. Inequality is important, but it in many ways is symptomatic. And here's what I posit. We are actually more concerned about opportunity, we're concerned about mobility, we're concerned about cohesion, we're concerned about dignity, which Mathew talked about. I can add some more, I mean, it's not a comprehensive. We're concerned about perceived equity, we're concerned about subjective well-being, or what psychologists call happiness. And Donald actually added another one, we're concerned about identity. So there are a couple of others, and it's actually underlying this whole conversation on inequality. And when we come to that level, then we can really talk about what we should be doing going forward. So here, equality on the left is sameness, equity on the right is not treating people the same, but trying to level people up. And some people call it justice, you can call it other names. But perhaps that's what we should be concerned about. And so when you look at national values in Singapore, there's a recent survey, it's the 3rd edition of this survey. You see personal values of Singaporeans, family, health, caring, friendship, responsibility, compassion. And you see same survey, same people, same time. what Singapore society is today, kiasu, complaining, competitive, materialistic, blame, kiasi, self-centeredness. Something's happening because it's the same respondents. And then you ask, what would they like to see in society? Affordable housing, care for the elderly, compassion, caring for the disadvantaged, concern for future generations. So these are the expressed feelings and the expressed views of Singaporeans doing the same survey. And here's some food for thought. What is our current trajectory? There was this essay called The Fate of Empires by Sir John Glubb. It was discussed most recently in Singapore's context by Lim Siong Guan and Joanne Lim, who wrote this book called Winning with Honor. And they talked about what is the average lifespan of an empire or a nation, if you like, in our context. And it turns out that empirically, it's about 250 years, right, plus or minus, right? And what happens? How is it that they rise and how is it that they fall? So they actually go through several stages: age of pioneers, conquest, commerce, affluence, intellect, decadence, age of decline. So I have no time to go through all the signposts that typify what ages you're in. But age of affluence, you see materialism, you see wealth. Age of intellect, you see the rise of academic institutions like this, research. And then age of decadence, you see a downfall. What happens? The rise is due to economic prowess or military might. Money actually gives you affluence. The fall comes because of money. It's the same thing, but different parts of the spectrum, different parts of the stages that we go through. And it's not deterministic, but it's food for thought to ask ourselves, where are we? Where are we in this scheme of things? And if you look at the signposts, by the way, one of the signposts for age of decadence is the welfare state. Interestingly enough. Now, it's not deterministic, but it means that if we're not careful about how we shape society through our policies and what we do, we actually may end up in a place that we don't want to be. So some quandaries and dilemmas from a public policy perspective. How much should the government do without diminishing individual resilience and without crowding out family and community support? Is it a hand up or is it hand out? Do you breed cohesion? Do you breed compassion? Or do you actually hurt cohesion? How can we help in a way that does not inadvertently harm the individual? This Goldilocks principle, not too hot, not too cold, just right. What research shows is if you help too little, then you actually create a high cognitive bandwidth tax. And the bandwidth tax is when you find that individuals have so much to worry about because they're feeling poor. It's a state of mind. Your effective IQ drops, and your ability to solve problems actually drops. And so we want to try to avoid that. But if you give too much, what we also find is that incentives are such that you may actually not take the action that you could take in a timely fashion. So labeling, even calling people poor, actually diminishes your effectiveness in terms of functioning and problem solving. So that's something we need to be concerned about. And last question I just want to leave with you. What do we want for Singapore? Because it's not such a straightforward answer. And I believe that it's not just about what the government does, but it's also about what individuals, families, and a community can do to build Singapore together. And that, I think, is the larger question that we should ponder. Thank you.
I thank John. I think John has done a very good job explaining what the Singapore government does to help poor and low-income families. Where John has not been able to explain away is why in one of the most prosperous countries in the world, we have between 100,000 and 140,000 households that live in absolute poverty. That is morally unacceptable to me. It is also unacceptable to me that by per capita income, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we have 20 to 35% of our household living in relative poverty. That's not acceptable to me. And I remain convinced that Singapore needs a minimum wage. Without a minimum wage, some hardworking Singaporeans who are working hard but who's unable to earn a living wage. He or she not able to earn a wage that enable him or her to provide for the family. And I think that's wrong, you know. I think that's wrong. I know all the government's arguments against minimum wage, the alternative of progressive wage, but the bottom line is, and you know, I ask you to look at this wonderful daily broadcast by a brilliant Arab Israeli called Nas. He's the best public relations person for Singapore. He loves Singapore and admires Singapore. But I ask you to look at one of his videos called Crazy Poor Asians. He made the point that there are 1.5 million foreign workers working in Singapore. And on the average, they earn $600 a month. And he converted this into their hourly rate. And he said, you know, in one of the wealthiest countries in Singapore, the hourly rate of these workers is $1.90 per hour. You know, I mean, this is, to me, morally unacceptable. So I'm sorry, John. I think you did a good job, but I'm not convinced. The government's approach to helping the poor, the needy, the disabled is through what John called the Kueh Lapis approach, or what is more commonly referred to as many helping hands. Yeah, and I like this, many helping hands. The government can't provide all of the solutions. We need voluntary welfare organizations, NGOs, social enterprise to help. And one of the best voluntary welfare organizations in Singapore is the Singapore Children's Society. And I've invited Alex Lee to come and speak to us this evening about the good work that the Children's Society has done for many decades to help children from poor, needy, and dysfunctional families. Alex, please.
Thank you, Prof. Koh, for the appraisal of Singapore Children's Society that you gave us. Good evening, faculty and residents of Tembusu Hall, of our college, and honored guests. You've heard the few previous three speakers spoke a lot about the issues of inequality as well as poverty, and you heard John talking about the big picture. What I'm going to share with you in the next 15 minutes is what a humble charity Singapore Children's Society has been doing in bringing relief and happiness to children in need. Children's Society was set up in 1952. Our mission is the same as the topic of my presentation. I'll show you here our vision. And out of the 6 core values that we have, the one I want to emphasize is openness to change. Society changes at a very fast pace. Community changes at a very fast pace. Children's needs also change at a very fast pace. We have to stay extremely nimble, keep looking at whatever we're doing, reinvent our existing services, start new ones, and if some services prove to be no longer relevant, terminate them. We now have 4 service categories offered through 13 community-based service centers, 15 cabins, which are drop-in centers in secondary schools. And last year, we served a total of about 65,000 children, youth, and families. This chart shows our 3 major sources of income. In earlier years, we tend to raise most of our income more than 75%, and that gives us a lot of flexibility to pilot new services. At the same time, look at services, anticipate what are the likely needs as well. Because in the past, the government was more conservative, they need a bit more convincing. But as John has mentioned, in the past 10 years, the government have been a bit more proactive. And because of that, you might have noticed, the last few years, the amount of funding we get from public sources, the government and toll board has increased because government now prepared to fund pilot projects themselves, and we work together with them to leverage on the funding. The green portion is the other income, which tends to be mostly investment income. The last 10 years, our expenditure and income both grew by about twice, which is similar to previous year's trends. And income, 9 million to about 18 last year. Similarly, expenditure. You might have noticed the spike in 2015. That was when Singapore celebrated our 50th anniversary, and the government launched the SG50, the fund, to match some of the donations raised by the various charities. When Children's Society was started, with the very limited resources, but with quite a number of medical professionals, they were looking at how best we can make use of our resources to make the best of what we can do. And it was decided, yes, of course, we should focus on poor family. At that time, the needs are everywhere. And we found, well, okay, the problem then was notice a lot of children coming from poor family, go to the hospital, recover, discharge. But usually, if they go back to their own family, the nutrition will usually not be there. So we started the convalescent home to admit these children, give them nourishment for 2 to 3 months, build up the robustness, discharge them back to the hospital. Fortunately, the colonial government then saw the rationale of it and said, well, it's cheaper to fund such a home than expensive hospital beds for the children. In the 70s and 80s, we started looking at, well, what are the other basic, unmet basic needs? And at that time, we have fewer convalescing children because most of the families become more affluent. So, okay, why don't we change the criteria of our mission? Instead of just looking after convalescent children, we admit those who are coming from a bit more dysfunctional families, have been abused, neglected. And we also started the before and after school care, piloted such a center. The reason being that for those parents who usually at the lower social economic sector, normally they will have to work all days, and which means before and after school time, office hours, they cannot be around to look after the children. So we piloted the service, hope that the children won't become latchkey kids, somebody to care for them. And we also started a phone line, we call them Tinkle Friend, to encourage primary students, okay, if you have problems in school, you see problems at your home, problems with your friends, or even if you're bored, call this number. We have trained volunteers to talk to them. In the 90s, starting from the 90s, and we've got more resources, we looked at other needs, and we discovered, well, the less vulnerable group, teenagers and families, are also at risk. So we started youth trauma centers for them, family service center, as mentioned earlier by John. And we also do the child abuse and neglect research. Why we have to do this? Because at that time, I'm sorry to say, government say there's no child abuse and neglect in Singapore. So we've got to do a fair bit of research to increase public awareness of the issue, lobby the government, please do something for this group. And now, I'm glad that I say that the far better services for this group. And after doing all this advocacy, why don't we expand our research capability to look at other issues, better advocacy, or to make sure our services are evidence-based? So we started the research department. Then in 2000, we said, well, let's look at yet another group of risk or target group to receive our services. Teenagers from dysfunctional families and teenagers with unmet basic needs. And our children's home, then we change the criteria to keep looking after them until they become teenagers. Sometimes it's very important because can you imagine a child move from their own home to a children's home? At the age of 12, they're going to move on yet to another home. But also remember that looking after young children and teenagers, totally different set of challenges. They live in the same premises, that gives you a lot of challenges. And we also found that, well, a lot of the problem with some of the secondary school children is when they go to secondary school a lot of freedom, so exposed to a lot of risk. And we found that even upper primary students have that problem. And for some reason, some of them don't go to student care center, so we started a child service center for them, drop-in center. And like I said earlier, the government started piloting a lot of new services, so we do outreach services together with a partner with the government. We now have 4 service categories. The most intensive one is for the vulnerable children and youth. Sunbeam Place, which is our children's home. Gone through a lot of reiteration. We keep on changing the nature of our services. Initially, we cannot look after Malay children. We then say, no, we cannot. That cannot be right. So we change. But that is one area where we found that inequality actually create lots of problems for children from poor family. In the old days, 20, 30 years ago, you run a home, the most important thing you need to provide for is physical care, medical attention. But now, in recent years, children come to our home, emotional well-being, academic achievement, they're way, way behind even the average children in the average family. Forget about the top 10% or whatever. So whatever we can do, we do. We recruited a lot of professional staff, teachers, and make sure that education will help them, and social, emotional well-being we're going to help them, because quite often they're being teased at school, and mostly they're always scolded by parents, scolded by the teachers as well. And when Singapore introduced the Compulsory Education Act 2003, we worked with the Ministry of Education to reach out to parents who do not send their children to registration primary school, or for some reason don't go to school at all. So far, I think we've done about 700 plus cases. And in 2009, we went upstream. We worked with the Early Childhood Development Agency to reach out again to families with children who don't go to preschool. Because if they don't, the moment they start primary school, they definitely lag behind. It becomes a very difficult task for them just to catch up. Last year, we started the Safe and Strong Family, which is a new initiative by the MSF. As I said, they become a bit more proactive nowadays. And this is to help children who are under foster care or already in home, to help them to go back to their own families. You might have remembered 2016, there was this 14-year-old boy, Benjamin Lim, who was interrogated by the police and for alleged molestation, and subsequently committed suicide. And last year, together with Ministry of Home Affairs, Social and Family Development, National Council of Social Service, we trained qualified adults to accompany these young suspects when they're being interviewed, to make sure, well, watch, are they being stressed? Try to help them understand the questions, at the same time provide some moral support. So far, we've got about 450 volunteers, and so far they've been activated about 1,100 times. But when the project goes full scale, which is expected towards the end of the year, we're expecting something like about 15 referrals every day. So a lot of children actually go into the, get into this kind of problem. For many years, we have been training volunteers to help young children who have got to appear in witnesses in court. It's a very daunting to all these children. And for the less vulnerable children and youth, we have another service, Children and Youth Service. Usually, we have one student care center, which is after-school care, because now it's only single session school, only need after-school care. And we have 6 community-based drop-in centers, 15 cabins, which are drop-in centers in secondary schools. These centers provide a safe place for children to play, do their homework, make friendship. And what we do is we try to expose them to some art, craft stuff, whether it's performing art, band, drawing, singing, even cooking, fashion design even, to help them to be exposed to more different categories of life and hope that they can find something that they're good at. The moment a child builds up self-esteem in themselves, I think more or less a child is safe. Then they'll definitely continue with education. I talk about the phone line that we installed back in the 80s, the Tingle Friend. We found that at the start of this decade, the number of calls came down. I wonder why. Must be because the channel is now changed. A lot of children now become keyboard savvy. So we developed another channel for them to communicate with us. Sure enough, last year, about 2,000 plus calls coming through chat line keyboard. The other 1,000 plus full phone. So service, the needs always change. You keep on have to modify them. We also provide family service centers. We have one family service center, standard programs similar to the 30 plus other service centers that provide, but all the optional programs we do focus on children. And we provide support and programs for children and young persons who are beyond parental control. Some of this, unfortunately, got to go through the court system, which really damaged the parent-child relationship. So we try to divert them away from the court system, if at all possible, work with the family and to try to get these children back on the right path. We have a children's medical fund, which support families with children who, for whatever reason, don't qualify for Medifund Junior. We organize talks and workshops for parents, of course, and the last few years we've run a few programs for children, a bit more niche, caregivers with incarcerated family members. This is one of the least disadvantaged group. It's quite sad when you look at such a situation. We have a research arm, research and advocacy, and as I mentioned earlier, we initially look at the CNP, which is Child Abuse Neglect Prevention. Then we subsequently found that is one thing which damages children, but bullying is another thing. Likewise, 15 years ago, most of the schools would say, well, we don't have any bullying here. So we had to make sure that we have to do some research work to make sure that we stand on solid ground to increase our public awareness. This is a big problem. And now I'm glad to say that, well, the problem becomes more publicly recognized, and through some of the training that we do, children are better prepared, whether as victims, more importantly, sometimes bystanders, what you should do if somebody else is being victimized. And with all the study on the well-being and parenting, we find that, well, it's not a bad idea to publish some guidebooks, how to look after babies and children and toddlers. And we provide resources. We have an online directory to show, well, which centers, which VW have what sort of programs, so that for teachers, parents, even sometimes professionals, if we need something for our children, search the directory. We train the trainers. We can't do everything on our own. So now we have a program where we train the teachers in the kindergarten, let them go back to teach young children to avoid being sexually abused. And we run this Singapore Children's Society lecture once every year. Incidentally, last Saturday, we host a lecture by Professor Yu Yan on growing up in an equal society. We also run every 2 years a Singapore Children's Forum to give children a voice. Well, this is our footprint. The star is where our corporate office is. The little red dots are where our community-based service centers, and the 15 blue triangle are where our secondary school drop-in centers are. Well, you heard a lot about what I was talking about. If you're interested to do something meaningful, join us. All you have to do is go to our website, click on the volunteer with us button. Next page, click on the volunteer vacancies, find out where are these vacancies, what are they, and sign up with us. Thank you.
At this point in the program, we're inviting everyone in the audience, and particularly the students in the audience, to go to one of the microphones on either side and ask questions of any member of the panel. We'll have about 20 to 22 minutes of questions.
Yeah, I'm not a very good timekeeper this evening, so we're running a bit late. But we will adjourn at 9 p.m. as we normally do. So let me take 3 questions at a time. who would like to ask the first three questions?
And please do identify yourselves as either a member of the college or a member of department or faculty.
Any questions? Yes, on this side. There are two questions here.
All right.
Hi. Yeah. It's on.
All right.
It's on.
So, good evening, the four panelists, Prof. Tomiko, and all the distinguished guests. My name is Tian Xiang, a student from Tembusu College. So, I would like to have a question directed to Mr. John Lim. So, at the early part of your speech, you almost admitted that Singapore's welfare policy is confusing. And Dr. Mathews stressed the idea of inaccessibility of the help to the poor. And the very fact of the schemes are confusing means that Singapore is disempowering the poor from getting adequate health. So my question is, why is there only a sorely inadequate effort by the Singapore government to make the help easily accessible to the poor? Or worse, deliberate efforts to make the help inaccessible to the poor? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. Second question.
Hi, good evening. I'm Rosamund, and I'm a Tembusu alumni. I'm year 4 and I'm studying economics. Singapore currently has 0 capital gains and inheritance tax. My question is to all the panelists. Should we introduce capital gains tax and inheritance tax on our top 1% to reduce wealth inequality? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Third question.
Hi, nice to meet you guys. I'm sorry. I'm Mathew, a year 2 student in Tembusu College. My question applies more to us as students, actually, because there is a financial cost to every social interaction that we engage in, and in that itself, that kind of like creates social classes between those who are more well-to-do and those who are less well-to-do. So how do you propose, or how do you suppose we should go about managing this segregation based on wealth of the sorts? Because in the first place, our social interactions are limited by what we can afford to do. Thank you.
Let's take a few more questions. 2 more, please. Anybody? Okay. Okay, if not, then let's have some answers to the first 3 questions. John, there's one specifically for you. Did you actually say that the various assistance schemes are confusing? That's the first question. And
I did say that it could be confusing. All right? So I would say, well, firstly, we're in a setting where I think we should respect all views, right? I will say, though, that some of the... Who was the first person who asked the question? I would say, though, that it does sound like some of the questions were rather loaded. And it's okay. But one of the quickest ways that I think your mind would probably be changed is if you join MSF. And the reason for this is because I think I look at it through 2 points of view. One is, how does it appear to the public? How does it appear? And it's actually quite understandable. You know, when I talk about the schemes and the arrangements, I'm not saying it's perfect. By no means am I saying it's perfect. In fact, I'm acknowledging that there are issues to contend with. I noticed mine was the only kind of a presentation where Prof. Koh responded quite passionately in partial opposition to. And again, I think we respect all views, and this is a setting where I do think that the open discourse is better than if we just kept our views, right? But I would say that the interesting thing is that I think there's a lot more commonality in many of the positions that are being stated, then there are differences. We have differences in views on the thresholds. We can have differences in views on the number of schemes. We can have differences in views on how many, who delivers, how it's delivered. But like Prof. Koh, I think the person who is left by the wayside, that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable. I see a whole variety of cases, appeals on cases that we see, and the whole spectrum. And I see some people really struggling. In my personal capacity, I volunteered with some low-income children in Jalan Kukoh, one of the poorest areas in Singapore. And I see differences. I see a girl who we were working with, who, frankly, we don't know what to do, right? We've been kind of, this is supposed to be about helping with the English, right? And her father is incarcerated. Her mom is Indonesian, so for a long time couldn't work. And a lot of people are gathering around to help. But there's something that can't get through. And how do we do it? And both wearing my government hat as well as a volunteer hat, I have no idea how to get through to some of the individuals. But is it acceptable? It's not. And then the other kid that we worked with, he's really bright. He's topping his class in math a lot because his mom is really pushing, right? And so, we see a lot of promise there. But again, is it because of what we do? And is it because of the system? Well, not really. He gets a pocket money fund. I think they do get assistance. But we don't set out, in direct kind of response to the first question, we don't set out to create a system that is confusing. We don't set out saying, let me find ways and means to confound and confuse. Yeah, so, yeah.
We accept that, John. Thank you. Would anybody like to respond to the, Alex?
Yes, I'm speaking from the people sector. Quite usually I would fight against whatever MSF is doing. But I must admit that you have to look at the last 20 years how the social service has been improved. You look at how what DPM Palmer was saying, we're leaning left. We're leaning left. We're becoming more liberal. And the fact that the MSF set up all these social service office, I think is a step in the right direction. What I would ask you all to do is, don't just look at the government. Look at yourself. Look at your families, look at your friends. Don't be so self-centered. And like John was saying, we can't say that you must do this, you must do that. But if you see poverty and inequality as a problem, please, you have to do something about it. Whether volunteering or maybe spread the message, make more donation or whatever.
Thank you, Alex. So if you guys feel strongly about it, please volunteer at the Children's Society. Or donate to them. If your parents are wealthy, ask them to donate. Would anybody like to respond to the second and third questions, which I guess goes to the same point? Should we reintroduce capital gains and wealth tax for the top 1%? Are we becoming a society that's being segregated by wealth? Would Mathew and Jonathan like to? Mathew first.
Just quick point about the earlier question about inaccessibility of help. Since my name was mentioned, it is very clear that we have help. And if you look at rental blocks in Singapore where poor people live, there are just so many social service agencies trying to help individuals there. So one thing about it is I think help is well distributed all over the island. You've got banners everywhere. And based on all the studies we're doing, the low income knows that help is readily available. Of course, then the next question is what they expect from help. And that might be, they say, well, everybody says they want to help me, but they're not helping me the way I want to be helped. So of course, there might be a mismatch in terms of the help. The other thing about is the whole issue about what do we do to spread our wealth and better distribute incomes. So of course, many people have suggested this idea about inheritance tax, putting back capital gain tax. But just now the question was, well, why is it only the 1%? What about the 10%? What about the 20% at the top? Right? So obviously we don't want to be in a situation where we crucify every very rich person, and we have this loath against those who are the crazy rich Singaporean. I think there needs to be some kind of balance there. I don't think it's helpful for societal cohesion if we target one group and make them as if like they are the culprits who cause all the problems. I don't think that's right. I think the broader way has been always trying to get those who are more affluent to think about giving donations, work with charities. That's been the model. There are many good tax reliefs and things like that, which probably should incentivize them towards that. But then again, I think we have to think a little bit about, if you ask, again, our last IPS survey is like half and half. There is some attempt, some interest among those who are better off to give more back. And whether it's income tax, increasing income tax, whether it's inheritance tax. So I do think that over the years, we might have to think about that. But of course, then the whole question about, will this reduce our competitiveness if we are a nation which cares a lot about bringing in those who are extremely wealthy from around the world? Some of those questions.
Can I have one question? I'd like to ask, so what do you think are the challenges?
Wait, we've not finished yet. Let's finish the... Mathew, you want to finish your point?
Well, I can't remember where I stopped, but the broad point is that we don't want to be in a situation where we force a segregation between groups by putting all our anger and animosity of those who are very wealthy. So I think we must be careful.
I think that's an alternative, Instead of reimposing capital gain tax, estate tax, we should grow the culture of philanthropy. We should be more like the Americans, where wealthy people feel very strong sense of social responsibility to give back. This culture is growing. NVPC is doing very good work, but we can do more, I think.
I'll try to address the last question from around the inequality. What can we all do when it comes to inequality, even amongst our peers, and in terms of wealth and things like that? Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I have the answer, because I think it is quite difficult to impose our view on others. First of all, you shouldn't do that. And second of all, it is the reality of our world, unfortunately, or it depends on how you look at it, is that people do want to be different, and when they want to be different, there are a number of things that they evaluate. People size everybody up the minute they see. I don't know what it is, but that's what people do. And even from your home address, people already immediately know roughly your wealth, what you drive, and the clothes that you wear, the way you speak. People pay attention to all of those little final things. Even the things that you wear.
I object to that. Oh. I think only snobbish people do that.
Yeah, that's true. No, I agree with that one.
I think Tembusu College is against snobbery.
Yeah, not here. But the celebrity culture, as well as you see, some of the people that are defined as successful and this and that. But this is where I think we all can do, because we cannot impose, as I said, we should not and probably cannot impose our views on others, but we individually can take steps, right? We can reach out, we can make sure that we're conscious of our actions, what we say and what we do. I always say this to people. We cannot control what people do or say, but we certainly can develop a conscious effort to watch out our own way of interacting with others, developing our own empathy, developing our own understanding of the complexity of choices and life, and not quick to make a judgment just because we're looking at the service level. So I really hope that that addresses some of your, a portion of that question.
Okay. Let's take 3 more questions. Yeah.
I want to ask,
yes.
So what are the for those people, children who are from low-income families, they face certain challenges in life that they do not have the support of the families, and probably the parents do not are not able to provide them the supports they need in terms of education or even financially, emotionally. And currently we have all the debates about how education...
I don't make a speech. What's your question?
Oh, yeah. I mean, currently the education, we are talking about education being at a social level. So how effective will education be in actually trying to mitigate the inequality for children from low-income families?
Okay. Okay, so I guess, John, the question is education a social leveler in Singapore, right? I mean, education is compulsory, it's universal. I think the MOE view is that every school is a good school. So I guess, is education a social leveler, you know? Okay, next question, please.
Hello, yeah, my name is Kumar. I'm a year 4 political science student. So I just want to ask a question. A lot of the questions here and also the talk here has been about policy issues and seeing inequality as a problem of agency. Like if inequality is a problem, go and volunteer, go and change certain policies. However, like if we see inequality as a structural issue, what is a structural solution? How do we need to shift like ideologies in terms of, should we start questioning like our sacred cows like meritocracy, tripartism as well? Like we're not allowed to unionize, and also ideas of self-reliance. My second question is...
Wait, I don't get your question.
So my question is, should we start thinking about structural solutions? Because the speeches here so far have been about agency issues. It's been about what policies or people can just join philanthropy, but what about structural issues, ideologies? Yeah.
Okay, can you limit yourself to just one question?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
I guess, what structural reform we need in Singapore to bring about a more just and equal society? Okay, next question.
Hi, I would like to reference the survey that one of the speakers has brought up. You brought up a survey about the values that Singaporeans want to see in our society in the future, right? Because right now our society is kiasu, self-centered. We want to shift towards a more compassionate society. But I would like to argue that our ideology is not just internalized at a personal level, like one of the speakers has said, but it's also institutionalized at a national level. So for us to be able to shift to a more compassionate society, should there also be a simultaneous shift in the ideology that underpins our policies? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, there are 3 students here. Let's hear all of you, please. Go ahead.
Good evening, honored speakers, Professor Tomiko and distinguished guests. My name is Go Yang, and I'm currently a Tembusu alumni studying psychology. First off, I'd like to thank the speakers for sharing. My question pertains to the fact that education has been brought up countless times in this entire discussion, yet no one here actually is within the education system or within MOE that can give insight into the policies. And I think one policy that is on the back of many Singaporeans' minds is the problem of how primary school selection is still heavily favors the rich. And I agree that this might be slightly out of the scope of speakers here today. However, I would like to hear your honest opinion, given that there's no education, people from the education sector within this particular room, on what your honest opinions are on what needs to be done, particularly with primary school selection.
All right, thank you. Good question. Next. Yes, next.
Very good evening, distinguished guests and Prof. Ko, everyone. My name is Yash. I'm a year 2 political science major. My question today is also related to education. It's actually in relation to something that I believe Mr. John mentioned about meritocracy and inequality, actually. So I read an article, actually, in the Straits Times. It was mentioning these 2 points as well. And I'd like to know what is this relation, that, in your point of view, that you're speaking of between meritocracy and inequality, and how is that something that we as students can help to either benefit or champion in the future?
Thank you. The relationship between meritocracy and inequality. Yeah, the last question.
Hi, I'm Yan San. I'm year 2 Tembusu student. So I think a lot of people have talked about education in terms of students. I want to talk about education in terms of the working adults. So one of the way to break the poverty cycle is to like gain skills so that they are more employable, right? So there are many things like skills future or whatnot to help Singaporeans. So I'm wondering how effective has this been? And if it's not effective, what else can y'all do to help the poorer adults to find jobs? Yeah.
Can you repeat your question? I don't think I got your question.
Oh, so like.
Repeat your question.
So like, if how effective has the grants been in helping Singaporeans gain skills to be more employable, and if it's not effective, like what can y'all do next?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I think 6 very good questions, huh? 6 good questions. Some of them actually are related to each other. About education, is it a social level or whether it actually is biased towards the well-educated, wealthy? I think it's got something to do with admission to primary school, right? Question about whether we need a structural change, whether we need an ideological shift. Those 2 I would take together. Then what is the relationship between meritocracy and inequality? And then the current emphasis on skills training, is this going to reduce the gap or it's going to increase the gap? They're all very good questions. So we're going to close with this. So I'm going to go around the table, I think starting with you, Mathew. Just 1 to 2 minutes, please.
Let me just respond quickly to the ones on education. We did a survey just 2 years ago trying to understand parents' perceptions of primary school education, so it's a proper national study. And I think the big question about, one, all our brand name schools, do they just have people on the top bracket? Actually, it's not true. So if you look at the actual stats of it, they do have a decent portion of people who come from 3-room, 2-room flats. But clearly there are more, if you look at the Bukit Timah schools, they clearly have more from the private housing. But they still have substantial numbers of other groups. So to be fair, I mean, there are that. Number 2, in terms of school, I mean, when we looked at parents in terms of their own ranking, we had many, many items to look at in terms of what they thought of various issues, attention to student care, development, school competitiveness, structure. We realized, and we knew what school the kid goes to, so we have a good sense of it. At the end of the day, what we realized is that, number 1, when it comes to attention to students in terms of student development, school infrastructure, parents across school types, whether you go to a branded school or very normal school, it's people have very, very high respect to it. Where things differ is in terms of competition. Obviously, if you go to the Chinese type schools and some of our elite schools, competition is high. So of course, those are the push for you to be able to move up, to top places. So if you look at it very broadly, our Singapore system, our education system trains most people to be able to be gainfully employed. Whether you end up through an IT track, a polytechnic track, you'll be able to get a decent amount of money. But of course, then if you stack it up by those who get the best privileges, of course, then the gap becomes very, very big. So I think what we have is a system which I think if it properly works out, most Singaporeans will be able to, hopefully over time, get a decent life. But there'll always be those who would really have an extremely good life, and there will be a major gap. And of course, the question is whether that gap should exist.
Maybe I'll touch on the issue of should we have a structural change in the system. The communists tried it 100 years ago to be more equal. Everyone do whatever you can and take whatever you need. It just didn't work out. So we have to be a bit careful. So far, we've watched democratic socialism still seems to be perhaps one of the best mode. The other issue regarding education, I think that maybe we should, as a country, when we talk about lifelong learning, it should not be just for employability. We should look at empathy, we should look at perhaps how to have a happy family, a bit of the more humane kind of issues, not just employability.
Jonathan?
I'm going to address the last question again about these courses for working adults or the usage of skill features. That's right. So the short answer is yes, I see the benefit of having those. And also, from the Lian Center perspective even, so we run courses. There are, for working adults, nonprofit, we have a fully funded program for nonprofit leaders, for example. And then we have programs for university students and pre-university students as well. And the idea is also the type of courses that we offer. We take a conscious strategy is that we know hard skills, there are plenty of places that can offer you that. But what we see lacking often, and that's what we're focusing on, is the soft skill, right? So the idea of compassionate leadership, conscious leadership, understanding what is your mission and your drive, and what you cares about, and empathy, and all of these things, and which we feel that it should be the foundations of how the businesses, policymakers, or whoever, how they can go on and then have more meaningful and positive impact. It's not just chasing after the titles and the money and things like that, which I'm not saying that it's not important, but I think it should be also beyond that, understanding what your purpose is that is greater than yourself.
John, you have the last word.
Thank you. 6 good questions, very difficult, so I obviously can't treat all of them equally. I would say, though, with some trepidation, that my last posting was MOE before MSF, although I dealt with higher education rather than general education. So just a couple of comments. First, is education effective as a social leveler? This is as much a philosophical question as it is an empirical question, because we are at quite different points in our stage of development. In the earlier days, you talk about 5% went to university, 10%, it's a big deal. And then now, if you look at the stats, it's 96% of each primary 1 cohort goes on to post-secondary education. That's ITE, Polytechnic, university. So the short answer is, I believe that education is an important element of social leveling. I'm not sure that it is the only means, nor should it be the main means. And in fact, understanding the principal purpose of education in that it gives you skills, it gives you knowledge which you should then apply. That should be the fundamental purpose. And one of the reasons why we did Skills Future was because we recognized that the demand for university degrees was very high, but it was at a level that we can never satisfy. And when we looked at other societies, other countries, we saw promise and potential in some of how they did it. And this has to do with things like dignity. This has to do with what you value in society. Because when we look at Germany and Switzerland, it is the skills that are valued. And that, I think, is where we need to go. Education is one way to get there, because you don't want doctors who are not trained in medical school. But you need that academic pedigree for every single field. I'm not sure that that's true. In fact, if you want to be a successful tech startup, you should drop out of university. Yeah, may not be a good idea, but a shift in ideology. Yes, there has been. So I think we need to shift, and there has already been some shift. So let me give 2 examples. One is, I kind of mentioned in the early days, there was no real state support, and that has shifted, and it continues to shift to a point where I think we need to be quite careful about what we do, not because we want to stop doing anything. No, I think we've been in the right direction so far, and we need to continue to do more. But there have been other shifts. For instance, under many helping hands, one assumption was, if you're an economist, you say, you have perfect information, the market clears. Demand and supply match exactly, there is an equilibrium. This assumes perfect information. What we found is people do not have perfect information, precisely because there are many schemes, precisely because they find it hard to navigate the system, which is why the emphasis has now been, we need to shift so that we bring the accessibility and the help. So I didn't talk about exactly what we're going to do, but there's a whole stream of work going on to how to bridge the last mile, including helping people navigate the system. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. I just want to make a few concluding remarks. I want to begin by apologizing to John for giving him a hard time. Actually, I admire you and admire what MSF is doing. It sometimes takes a foreigner to have a more objective view of ourselves, you know? So I've been watching this 1-minute video that NAS has been making on Singapore. And you know, I mean, sometimes we take our own success for granted. and I ask you to look at them. I think Nas is right, that we should be very proud of what we have achieved in only 53 years. You know, we have educated our people, we have full employment, we have no homeless people. Although we're becoming very money-minded, no sick person is turned away by a clinic or a hospital. So there's universal health care. Not complete, but there's a good public safety. So we should be very proud of our many achievements. Singapore is a great success story. But as Nas said, it is not perfect. We have our problems. And everybody acknowledges, and I'm happy to say our fourth generation leaders acknowledge that inequality and poverty is a major challenge facing Singapore. The fourth generation leader drafted the presidential address at the opening of Parliament. And they've highlighted that one of the most important challenges facing us is poverty and inequality. So is there a structural shift? I'm not sure whether structural, but I think there has been an ideological shift. There's a willingness to acknowledge that it's a problem. I want to say to John that at a macro level, I have problems, no? Because I think there should not be absolute poverty in Singapore, and the percentage of relative poverty is too high. But I want to acknowledge that at a micro level, MSF, the VWOs, many other people are trying to help these low-income families. And I was very impressed by an article written by Dr. Maliki Osman on what helping this low-income family look like. Because it's hard work. It's hard work. And we must acknowledge that it's hard work. Every low-income family has a different problem, and sometimes many problems, and it requires the confluence of many agencies, many actors, to help each family solve its problem and to navigate its way forward. So I acknowledge that, you know. So I want to conclude this forum by saying that I think all five of us here agree that poverty, inequality is a major challenge to Singapore. The happy news is that our new political leaders acknowledge this as a fact, and they promise to do something about it. But Alex Lee has a very important message to us, which is that we shouldn't just depend on government. We can do something about it. Yeah? And I'm trying to encourage our wealthy people to embrace a culture of philanthropy. And I'm trying to encourage everyone, rich and poor, to embrace volunteerism. All of you can be volunteers, you know, and it goes a long way to attending to the needs of people. So my message to you is, be optimistic about your future. We live in a good country. We are not perfect, but all of us acknowledge that poverty and inequality is a major challenge, and we will, all of us in our own way, do something about it. Thank you.
I thank the panel, and a group of our students would like to continue this conversation in the first floor lounge and invite any other student here who wants to join them 5 minutes after, 5 minutes from now in the first floor lounge if you'd like to continue the forum. Thank you very much, and would ask all of the participants to line up in front. We'll take a group photo. Thank you very much.